In 1991, Hans Kammerlander and his partners, Karl Grossrubatscher and Friedl Mutschlechner, took on the challenge of climbing Manaslu, one of Nepal's most dangerous peaks. But the mountain lived up to its deadly reputation. A fatal fall shattered the team's ascent, and during their descent, an almost unimaginable event occurred, a lightning strike at high altitude. Rare and devastating, it marked the beginning of a desperate fight for survival. How did such a promising expedition unravel into this extraordinary tragedy? Manaslu, the 8th highest mountain in the world, stands as a towering challenge in Nepal's Himalayas, reaching an imposing 8,163 meters into the sky. Its beauty is undeniable, but the mountain's reputation is steeped in fear and respect. Locals honor it as the Mountain of the Spirit, reflecting its cultural and spiritual significance. Manaslu has also been referred to as the Killer Mountain in some accounts due to its history of fatalities, particularly from avalanches and unpredictable weather. However, this nickname is more traditionally associated with Nanga Parbat, a peak notorious for its high fatality rate. Manaslu does have its own grim statistics though. By 2022, 89 climbers had lost their lives on its slopes, while 2,172 had successfully reached its summit, yielding a success rate of around 60%. To understand how deadly Manaslu truly is, it helps to compare these statistics with other high peaks. Annapurna 1, for example, is known for its fatality rate of around 33%, making it the most dangerous of all 8,000-meter peaks. Everest, by contrast, sees a fatality rate of around 1%, with thousands of climbers attempting the summit each year. While Manaslu's death rate, roughly 9.9%, is not as high as Annapurna's, it remains among the more perilous mountains in the world. This rate equates to about 10 climbers dying for every 100 successful summits, placing it in the mid-range of risk compared to other 8,000-meter peaks. Several factors contribute to Manaslu's dangers. Its steep slopes are prone to avalanches, especially on the infamous Manaslu Serac, a treacherous area where ice and snow often collapse without warning. The unpredictable weather adds another layer of risk, with sudden storms capable of trapping climbers in freezing conditions. Even with supplemental oxygen, used by about half of all successful climbers, the high altitude takes a toll. The high fatality rate is driven by avalanches, falls, mental fatigue, altitude sickness, and being struck by falling ice, with natural disasters claiming more lives than anything else. These combined hazards make Manaslu one of the most perilous peaks in the world. However, Manaslu stands apart from the busier peaks like Everest. It's remote and wild, sitting above the Budi Gandaki Valley, a place of serene forests and rushing rivers. To even reach its base camp, climbers must first trek through rugged trails dotted with small villages. These villages are rich in culture, offering a glimpse into the traditional lifestyles of Nepal's Gurung and Bhutia communities. Their colorful prayer flags and humble homes contrast sharply with the harsh, cold heights of the mountain above. It feels like stepping into a different world, one filled with both beauty and danger. For many climbers, Manaslu is a stepping stone to Everest. It's not as technically challenging as some other peaks, but it's far from easy. Climbers use it to prepare for the sheer difficulty of scaling an 8,000-meter peak. However, even the most experienced mountaineers can find themselves caught off guard here. The high altitude, thin air, and extreme cold push the human body to its limits. Without enough oxygen, your mind slows down, your strength fades, and small mistakes can turn into deadly ones. By 1991, Hans Kammerlander had already made a name for himself in the world of mountaineering. Born in South Tyrol, Italy in 1956, Hans grew up surrounded by mountains but lived a simple, hard-working life. He was one of 6 siblings in a family that scraped by through farming. Life wasn't easy, but it was in those early years that Hans discovered his love for the mountains. As a boy, he would climb the local peaks, drawn by their mystery and the freedom they offered. Hans wasn't just a climber, he was a force of nature. He didn't climb slowly and cautiously like most mountaineers. He raced up peaks, covering thousands of meters of elevation in hours. He loved speed and adventure, often taking risks that others wouldn't dare. In his 20s, Hans became a mountain guide. But he didn't stop there. He tackled harder climbs, solo ascents, and new routes that few had tried before. By the 1980s, he had partnered with Reinhold Messner, one of the greatest climbers of all time. Together, they achieved feats that seemed impossible, including traversing two 8,000-meter peaks without descending below 7,000 meters. Hans wasn't driven by fame. He climbed because he loved it. The mountains were his escape, his challenge, and his home. He was known for his toughness, but also for his humility. Despite his incredible achievements, Hans remained grounded. He knew that the mountains didn't care about your reputation or your skills. One wrong step, and they could take everything from you. Hans's love for skiing also led to groundbreaking achievements on other peaks. In 1990, he became the first person to ski down Nanga Parbat, descending from its 8,125-meter summit to base camp. The descent was nothing short of revolutionary, involving treacherous steep faces and requiring a blend of technical precision and raw courage. These pioneering ski descents redefined what was possible in high-altitude mountaineering, bridging the gap between climbing and skiing in ways no one had ever imagined. Manaslu, with its deadly beauty, was exactly the kind of challenge that called to Hans. By 1991, he had climbed many of the world's highest peaks and had proven himself in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. But Manaslu was different. Its history was filled with tragedy. In 1972, an avalanche wiped out a Korean expedition, killing 15 climbers and Sherpas. Even though the mountain wasn't as crowded or well-known as Everest, it had a reputation for being just as dangerous. Hans wasn't going to climb Manaslu alone. He was part of a team that included Karl Grossrubatscher, a fellow climber from South Tyrol, and Friedl Mutschlechner, an Austrian with a big heart and an even bigger sense of humor. Karl was steady and reliable, the kind of person you'd want by your side when things got tough. Friedl Mutschlechner, on the other hand, brought a different energy to the group. He was known for his humor and lightheartedness, which had a way of easing tension even in the most grueling situations. But Friedl was much more than just the team's morale booster. He was an accomplished climber himself. His mountaineering resume included successful ascents of Kangchenjunga, Makalu, and Shishapangma. The team set out with determination, their sights fixed on the summit of Manaslu. Each step they took brought them closer to their goal, but the mountains seemed to test their resolve at every turn. From the moment they reached base camp, challenges piled up. The weather was relentless, with dark clouds hovering over the peak and fresh snow falling almost daily. The climbers spent much of their time carrying gear to higher camps, laying ropes, and then retreating to wait for better conditions. It was grueling work, both physically and mentally. The group was on edge as the days stretched on. Every delay felt heavier than the last, and time was slipping away. Their permit was nearing its expiration, and the constant snowfall made the slopes even more treacherous. As May arrived, a brief weather window gave the team hope. Hans, along with Karl Grossrubatscher and Friedl Mutschlechner, decided to seize the opportunity. Together, they planned a final push for the summit. Other members of the expedition, worn out from the punishing conditions, chose to stay back. For Hans, Karl, and Friedl, the mountain's call was irresistible. They set out early, moving steadily through the snow-covered slopes. Camp 1, perched at 5,600 meters, marked the first stage of their ascent. The air was already thin, and the effort of climbing was immense. At this altitude, every breath felt like a battle, and even simple tasks required focus and energy. Still, the three climbers pressed on. Camp 2 awaited them at 6,250 meters, and then Camp 3 at 7,000 meters. Each camp brought them closer to the summit, but also deeper into the mountain's grip. As they climbed higher, the environment grew harsher. The burning oil fields in Kuwait during the Gulf War had released particles into the atmosphere, creating unusual weather patterns even in the Himalayas. Snow fell tainted with dark particles, and the air itself felt strange. Static electricity charged the air, crackling faintly against their equipment. It was as though the mountain itself was alive, humming with a quiet, ominous energy. The trio reached Camp 3, their final staging point before the summit attempt. At this altitude, they were well into the death zone, where the lack of oxygen begins to take a toll on the body. Every step felt heavier, every breath more labored. On May 10th, they began their summit push in the early hours of the morning. The weather was unstable, but they knew this was their last chance. As they climbed, the snow deepened and the winds intensified. Friedl, who had suffered frostbite on a previous expedition, felt his toes freezing again. Knowing the risks, he made the difficult decision to turn back. He descended toward Camp 3, leaving Hans and Karl to continue the ascent. The two pressed on, their sights set on the summit. Karl stopped briefly to take photographs, wanting to capture the awe-inspiring beauty of the mountain. But tragedy struck. Somehow Karl lost his footing. Whether it was a misstep or a sudden shift in the unstable snow, no one will ever know. He fell only a few meters, but it was enough. He struck his head and broke his neck, dying instantly. Hans, shaken and grief-stricken, found Karl's body soon after. He and Friedl buried their friend in a crevasse, a painful but necessary act. The mountain had claimed its first life of the day. Hans and Friedl, now carrying the weight of their loss, knew they had no choice but to descend. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with heavy snow and howling winds. Their skis, left at Camp 2, would help them descend quickly once they reached it. They made their way down carefully, step by step, navigating through blinding snow and treacherous ice. As they approached Camp 1, the storm intensified. Thunder rumbled through the air, and lightning flashed ominously across the sky. Hans could feel the static electricity building around them. Their ice axes and other metal equipment began to hum faintly, a chilling reminder of the power of the storm. Friedl, ever optimistic, reassured Hans that they were safe on the flatter terrain near Camp 1. But the mountain had other plans. Just meters from the safety of Camp 1, a bolt of lightning struck. Hans was thrown to the ground, disoriented and stunned. When he called out to Friedl, there was no response. He crawled toward his friend, finding him motionless in the snow. The lightning had struck Friedl directly, killing him instantly. Hans was now completely alone. Desperate and terrified, Hans managed to drag himself to Camp 1. He spent the night in the small tent, unable to process the horror of what had happened. 2 of his closest friends were dead, taken by the mountain in a matter of hours. The storm raged on outside, but inside the tent there was only silence and grief. The next morning, Hans began the long descent to base camp. He carried the weight of his loss with every step, each movement a reminder of the tragedy he had just endured. The mountain, which had once called to him with its beauty and challenge, now seemed cold and cruel. When Hans Kammerlander returned to base camp, the weight of the tragedy on Manaslu was impossible to ignore. Karl Grossrubatscher and Friedl Mutschlechner, 2 of his closest friends and trusted climbing partners, were gone. The news of their deaths left the team in stunned silence, and the reality of what had happened felt almost too much to bear. After the tragic events on Manaslu in 1991, Hans Kammerlander's life took a significant turn. Shaken to his core by the loss of his closest friends, he decided to step away from high-altitude mountaineering. The thought of facing another 8,000-meter peak felt impossible. Instead, he shifted his focus to climbing in familiar territory, the Alps and the Dolomites. These mountains, closer to home and less fraught with danger, became his refuge, a place to rediscover his connection with climbing on a more personal and less perilous level. Hans didn't abandon the mountains altogether. Instead, he sought new ways to channel his energy and passion. He began sharing his experiences through books and public talks, reflecting on both the triumphs and the profound losses he had endured. His writing, marked by honesty and vivid detail, captivated readers and offered a rare glimpse into the mental and emotional toll of high-altitude mountaineering. His book 7 Summits became a cornerstone of modern mountaineering literature, inspiring climbers and adventurers alike with its blend of storytelling and insight. Despite his shift in focus, Hans's achievements continued to cement his place among the world's mountaineering elite. He set world records for speed ascents, including an extraordinary climb of Mount Everest in 1996. Ascending from base camp to the summit without supplemental oxygen in just over 16 hours, Hans shattered expectations and held the record for 10 years. This ascent was not merely a feat of speed, it was a testament to his resilience and skill. However, his ambition didn't stop at the summit. Hans attempted to ski down Everest, an unprecedented challenge that combined his 2 great passions, climbing and skiing. Although the descent was interrupted due to poor snow conditions, his attempt remains one of the most daring projects in mountaineering history. Despite these accomplishments, Hans could not escape the shadow of Manaslu. The mountain remained a haunting presence in his life, a symbol of both his greatest loss and his deepest fears. In 2001, Hans publicly declared that he would not attempt to climb all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks. Manaslu, the peak that had claimed his friends, was the reason. For Hans, the idea of returning to the mountain felt like betrayal. Staying away became a way to honor the memories of Karl and Friedl, whose lives were inextricably linked to its slopes. Yet, as the years passed, the weight of unresolved grief began to stir within Hans. By 2017, more than 25 years after the tragedy, he decided to confront his past. This time, it wasn't about breaking records or achieving a summit. It was about finding closure. Hans returned to Manaslu with a small team and a film crew, embarking on an emotional journey to face the mountain that had shaped his life so profoundly. The climb was fraught with memories. Every step on the familiar slopes brought back vivid flashes of 1991, from the camaraderie of the ascent to the devastating losses during the descent. But this time, Hans approached the mountain differently. He no longer saw it as an adversary to be conquered. Instead, he viewed it as a teacher, one that had imparted harsh but invaluable lessons about ambition, humility, and the fragility of life. Though the expedition was challenging, Hans successfully descended from the mountain, carrying with him a newfound sense of reconciliation. He did not seek to erase the pain or the memories, but rather to integrate them into his journey. For Hans, Manaslu had become more than just a peak. It was a reflection of life's unpredictable beauty and hardship. Today, Hans Kammerlander is celebrated not only for his mountaineering records, but also for his willingness to confront the emotional complexities of his adventures.